Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Conversations, the Power of Art in Moments of Crisis. I'm at Rollins College, and I want to welcome you all to this virtual event, which is the first in a series of summer events. So please make sure you follow us on social media to get updates on our upcoming events for the summer and the fall. Today, I'm here with Dr. Anna Heller, Group and Field Director of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and Abigail, Goodman and Curator of Contemporary Art. Before I pass it on to Anna, I want to encourage you all to submit comments and questions through the chat, and we will have a Q&A following our presentations today, and I hope that we can all engage in a conversation about the works presented here today. So we're going to start with Anna. We're going to present a selection of works from our collection, and then we'll go into a Q&A. So Anna.
Thank you, Gisela. And Dina and Abby, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Okay, excellent. First of all, I want to thank all of you participating today for being here. I want to acknowledge, as we settle into this conversation, that it is a privilege to be able to have it, to be able to immerse ourselves in works of art, to be in the presence of and acknowledge the power of art is a privilege I am acutely aware of. And I want to thank you all, our museum's visitors, friends, partners, for enabling us to make this our work every day of every year, and particularly in this difficult historical moment. We are, of course, living through dual crises. One of them, pandemic, is of the moment and global, while the other one, racial injustice, is ongoing and systemic. Conquering the former can and will happen in the near future through advances in science and the discovery of an effective vaccine. The latter, by contrast, demands an honest acknowledgement of and reckoning with our country's history, both past and present, and a willingness to change, to dismantle structures of power, to make them inclusive and equitable. So as we think about these things, one immediate question that comes to mind for those of us working in museums is, does art matter? In a moment dominated by racial, social, and ethnic discrimination, by food shortage and health insecurity, systemic brutality and crime against people of color, and a pandemic that disproportionately affects those discriminated against. In this moment, what is, if any, what is the role of art? Is it relevant? Can art help? Should we take the time to discuss it? And importantly, can art teach us anything? And this last question is particularly important here at Cornell Fine Arts Museum as a college museum, campus museum on the campus of a liberal arts college. Teaching and learning, as you all know, define our mission. So the question for us today is, what can we learn about this moment? How can art help us navigate it? Clearly, our position is that art does matter. It matters because artists give visual voice, give material presence, and hence permanence to fleeting moments. They provide context, different perspective, different angles, and entry points into current realities. They express feelings, make us uncomfortable, give us hope, move us. They give us the gift of seeing the world enlarged, while at the same time finding our very own unique place in this world. And it's exactly this connection between the universal and the very personal message that a work of art gives you gives every one of us that Gisela, Abby, and I would like to explore in the first part of our conversation. We have each chosen a work from the permanent collection of the museum, a work that talks to this particular moment while at the same time to our own experience navigating it. So I'm going to get us started, and I want to talk about a sculpture which is currently installed. If I could have the next slide, please. A sculpture that is currently installed in our collection gallery at the museum. It's in the back of the gallery, seen from here, and it is the sculpture by Dan Vo entitled "We the People." Dan Vo is a Vietnamese-born Danish performance and conceptual artist whose practice mostly questions and recasts historical moments, political ideas, and notions of identity, be it individual or communal, societal, that have shaped and continue to shape our world. He was born in 1975 in Vietnam in the wake of the fall of Saigon, and so a national tragedy as well as a personal tragedy, the death of his younger brother, I'm sorry. And shortly after that, in 1979, the family managed to leave Vietnam. His father raised money and helped build a wooden vessel that held about a little over 100 people. And they made their escape with the dream of arriving in the United States. But a few days into their perilous journey, they were picked up by a Danish freighter, and so went to Denmark and asked for political asylum there instead, which is where he grew up. And I mentioned these personal history because it is relevant to a lot of the artist's practice, and while he acknowledges that elements of autobiography are form his practice, he does not see them as exceptionally his own. So it's that relationship between the personal and the societal and the universal that is important to him. He wrote at one point, "I don't really believe in my own story, not as a singular thing anyway. It weaves in and out of other people's private stories of local history and geopolitical history. I see myself, like any other person, as a container that has inherited these infinite traces of history." I just love the way he puts it, the infinite traces of history that we all carry with us in our lives. And this is very much the case. This background is very much a part of the conceptual work that we are looking at in the sculpture in our collection. If I could have the next slide that shows the close-up of the sculpture. It is called "We the People." Can we advance? Yeah, thank you. It is called "We the People," and it is part of an epic 5-year long process or project, which took on the fabrication of an exact replica to scale of the Statue of Liberty. He commissioned it to a factory in China, and it is the same, again, it's to scale, and it's the same material. It's cast in aluminum and then coated or skinned with a layer of copper, and it's some 300 plus sculptures, which are at once autonomous works and fragments of this larger conceptual project, whose name is in turn a fragment, "We the People." He worked on this project between 2011 and 2016. And unlike the Statue of Liberty, which inspired the work, which was cast in parts and then assembled, this project is never meant to be assembled. It's never meant that individual sculptures are never meant to be shown in one place. They're dispersed throughout the world in collections. And that says something about the meaning behind it. If I can go to the next ones, you'll see that some of the fragments or some of the sculptures very easily identify themselves or are instantly legible as part of the statue. Yeah, excellent. You know, the toes, the parts of the and eye fingers, the chain links, but others, and this is the case with ours, and a lot of the parts of the drapery, read more like abstract sculptures, at least at first. But so knowing about the overall symbolism of the piece and the way it was created helps us unpack the meaning. And when you think about these works being shown one at a time, or a few at a time sometimes, but in different places throughout the world, the piece really metaphorically embodies the fragmentation of the American body politic, the fragility of the philosophy that the Statue of Liberty enshrines, as well as talking to, and this relates to, in a way, to the artist's experience, but to all of our experiences in this country, the notion of dislocation, of displacement, of immigration. When I included this work about a year ago in a gallery talk I gave that was titled All About New York, and I'm reflecting about my former home, I was thinking mostly and talked about mostly about this experience of immigration, which my family shares with the family of the artist, and thinking about how the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty shifts people who one day arrive into the United States, like Dan Bo's family did, and then for people who live here and learn the history of the country in a different way. Today, as I was thinking about this conversation and I'm taking in the same sculpture, I find myself thinking about something entirely different. And I find myself thinking mostly about the broken state of our system and its fragility at this particular moment, the fragility of the ideals embodied by the Statue of Liberty as a monument and expressed in Emma Lazarus's poem inscribed in on the pedestal. And I think for all of us today, it is absolutely impossible to read these verses. Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free, without thinking of George Floyd's last moments. So thereby lies the power of art. The statue hasn't changed. The work of art hasn't changed, but our relationship with it constantly changes. And if I can have the next slide, I think as we pause to think about that notion, about how at different times in our lives, at different historical times in the life of our country, of our community, of our group of people, of our families, we see works of art differently. I think there's one other aspect that I would like to lift today, because I think it's one way of looking at a work of art that we ought not to forget in this moment. Could I have the next slide, please? Today, many of us seem to find it difficult to talk. There was one in between, one back. There you go. I think a lot of us today find it hard to think and talk about beauty, the simple aesthetically that works of art bring into our lives. We seem afraid. I know I have been, that it may be interpreted as a lack of sensitivity to the seriousness of the historical moment, or perhaps escapism. But I really do believe that we should not forget that art brings not only meaning, but also beauty in our life. And in that context, I think it is not indulgent to take a moment and enjoy the sheer physical beauty of the sculpture by Dan Vo, its materiality, its texture, the way light hits it. And that's why I wanted to show this other angle of it, the three-dimensionality that invites you to look close up and discover the details, the way it stops in your tracks by its physical presence before you stop and look and think about what it means. So unfortunately, that aspect of it is hard to fully understand or embrace in a slide. And so I just want to indulge in a nostalgic moment. The last slide that I have shows the gallery full of students. And it was a group of middle school students who were listening to our Higgs Fellow last year, Morgan Snow, explaining the meaning of the Dan Vo sculpture. And I just want to end my reflection here with this slide with the hope that we can all be in the gallery again very soon and be able to enjoy and immerse ourselves in the physical presence and the important message that these works of art bring into our lives. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Yes? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anna, for presentation on the sculpture by Dan Vo. I want to talk about the work that is on your screen right now. Is the one that I selected for my part of the presentation. This is a work by Antonio Martorell titled Que es la que esquela from 2018. Antonio Martorell is a Puerto Rican artist with a career spanning almost 5 decades, and his practice is driven by political and social events that take place in Puerto Rico, but although not exclusively. Many of his works are characterized by a very sharp critical viewpoint, often conveyed through satire and wordplay. The language has been consistently at the core of his creative production, as we see here. This monumental work titled Que es la que esquela, which we see here in the context of the gallery, this is opposite the wall where Dan Vo's sculpture, We the People, that Anna just talked about, is. So here, this work, which was acquired last year, addresses the very real effects of a natural disaster and the inefficiency of the local and federal government to address it. As you may know, Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico in September 20th of 2017 when it made landfall. It devastated the island, destroyed its power grid and communication systems, and overall caused damage to an island that was already weakened by the impact of Hurricane Irma a mere 2 weeks prior. The death toll, and that's a point of focus for Martorell in this piece here, and where he gets into the very political and also the human aspect of this moment, of this crisis that followed the hurricane. The death toll was established at 16 when President Trump visited the island on October 3rd after the hurricane. It was later raised to 64, and it remained there for a while. And even though hospitals and funeral homes were at capacity and overflown with people who passed away either during the hurricane and many of them right after. Martorell here creates a monumental triptych covered in black felt and places the map of the island over it, made with obituaries that are painted over, partially covering the information about the deceased. Martorell draws attention to the twofold crisis: the natural disaster on the one hand, and the crisis created by the government in their inefficacy addressing the effects of the hurricane on the other. Two independent studies, one conducted by Harvard and another one by George Washington University, confirmed that there were at least 2,975 deaths as a result of Hurricane Maria. So Martorell here is posing a question for viewers, and in his effort to document this moment of crisis, on the top left, and as part of the title of the work, the word queslaque, ask a question, in very colloquial Spanish, equivalent to a greeting saying, "What's up?" The response on the lower right-hand corner of the piece, a play on words. Esquela, if we see those three syllables together, esquela is the Spanish word for obituary. So the answer to the question, what's happening or what's going on, is basically death. That's what's happening. But when seen separated, the three syllables with the ellipsis, as Martorell tells us, the word turns into esquela, which is the beginning of an explanation, as if to say in English, what it is that. Martorell referring to these words as part of the explanations that politicians and local officials would give when reporters and people would inquire about the number of deaths in the island, an empty attempt, a hollow answer to this question. The work is one response to this moment of crisis. It pays homage and memorializes those who died, whose names we may not know, whose stories we may not know, and who remained unacknowledged and overlooked by local authorities. Martorell said about this, quote, "Those who are denied their death are denied their existence," end of quote. So among so many works in our collection, I selected this one to talk about today because it shows the multiple layers and angles of a crisis and underscores the importance of our creation, not just to react and to express, but to document, to denounce, to question, to examine moments of crisis. Historically, as we know, artists have created works in moments of conflict, during war, during civil unrest, in moments of great transition. In all of these, art has been at the core of cultural shift. So I've been thinking a lot about this work and what it represents as we have experienced the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, not just here in our community, but as we see how it's affecting the world. We are once again asking ourselves how this crisis will change us as a community. And I wonder how many more have died because of poor health care, because they can't afford to stay home, or because others refuse to wear a mask, or simply because they did not have a support system appropriate to deal with this situation. So I hope that in the future, when we ask queslaque, we don't have to respond esquela when we look back at this particular moment with the COVID-19 pandemic and this crisis. So I'm going to turn it over to Abby, who's going to highlight another work from our collection, and then we can go into Q&A and a conversation.
Thank you so much, Gisela. Thank you, Anna. I'm so honored to be here today and appreciate being included in this conversation. When I was considering what work from the Alphon collection of contemporary art to speak about, Carrie Mae Weems' untitled Woman with Daughter, which is an outtake from the artist's 1990 Kitchen Table series, especially resonated. The series, which is comprised of a total of 20 images and 14 text panels, all made at Weems's at home at her kitchen table, is her meditation on the experience of womanhood, inclusive of various layers of identity and social structure, being a Black woman, a mother, a partner or lover, a friend. It presents images of connection and solitude, joy and frustration, independence and family ties, Consistently framed in a narrow domestic space, lit from a single source, the images in their seriality allow the viewer to engage with the artist's consideration of what she has called the battleground of the family, as well as issues of race and class. The specific triptych in CFAM's collection, seen here on the screen, focuses on the relationship between a mother and a daughter. In the first image on the left, the daughter stands behind her mother, observing her at study or work. In the second, there is a palpable sense of their power dynamic as they confront each other across the landscape of the table. The mother asserting her strength, the daughter holding her own with a tentative but direct gaze. In the third and final image, they are seated side by side at the table, each absorbed in their efforts, but holding common space. Living through the crisis of COVID-19 with its quarantining, isolation, and concentration of family time, I have been focused very much on my own relationship with my 3 daughters and how we imperfectly, but with great love, navigate our mother-daughter dynamics. That is one way that I engage with these images, through the projection of what is shared in the experience of mothering between me and the character that Weems, as curator Adrian Edwards stated, is performing for the camera. At the same time, as I continue to engage in the work of better understanding the constructs of race and systemic racism, I also see these images in their specificity, through the lens of all the additional burdens placed on Black mothers. I read the image now with heightened awareness that the woman portrayed by Weems is not only embodying the universal maternal instinct to nurture and guide her daughter, but like other Black mothers, has profound additional fears, anxieties, and concerns. I imagine the terror she must carry and the determination to preserve her daughter's safety and future, despite the vice grip of white supremacy and inequity. I chose a career in the arts because I experienced early on that images and objects can transport us. Later, I came to understand that artists help bear witness through their work, and that they frequently make artworks that are at once formally rigorous. In this case, consider the central vanishing point of the composition, the limited black and white palette, the rich surface of the silver gelatin prints, which hopefully you'll get to see in person someday soon. And that those things are one way into the work, but that they are also, these objects, portals into understanding the experience of others. Weems has reflected in the past that she makes these images for anyone who is willing to engage with her and the themes of race, feminism, social justice, and power. This work, as much as any other in the Alphon collection of contemporary art, makes a case for visual literacy, for the transformative power of encounters with art, and for the role of museums in a moment of crisis or otherwise. I will pause there so that we have enough time to answer questions, but Gisela, I'll turn it over to you, but thank you all so much.
Thank you, Abby, for that reflection on this work by Carrie Mae Weems, which, by the way, we are installing in our galleries, and it will be on view when the museum reopens. So I was wondering if those of you who are with us today, if you have questions, if you would like to submit them on the chat, then we can pass them on to our speakers today. And just to get us started, I had one question here. In terms of revisiting these works, these are works that are beloved in our collection that we know that we teach with, and therefore we approach them with our students and our faculty and our community from different vantage points, right? Not just from looking at their artistic merits and the story that the artist is telling, but also we engage with students and faculty and community trying to unpack these images from different viewpoints. So I wonder for you, Anna, and for you, Abby, what is it like to revisit these particular works in this moment from this particular context and thinking about how we may teach with them with this experience?
Do you want to go first, Anna?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there are 2 levels there, and I think this is what makes my experience as working in a college art museum so rich, because there's always, and my entire career I've worked in museums or taught, so there's always a level of personal interpretation. And the beauty of what we do is that, as I said before, the meanings often change, or parts of the meanings take on different relevance depending on different moments. But working at CFAM and thinking always about works of art through the perspective of teaching adds another layer. And it's really interesting, because thinking about these works from the perspective of our students, and especially as I get older and as I have a daughter of the age of our students at Rollins, it's interesting to see how often very differently they will interpret not only what's happening, but also how what's happening is reflected by the works of art. So I honestly, for me personally, it adds to the learning experience. I have learned so much more because of seeing what we do at the museum through the eyes of our students. And then again, seeing it through the eyes of the rest of our audience, which is different and which sometimes is more akin to my own because of the age groups. But it's that relationship, it's the multi-generational experience of an academic museum that I think enriches our appreciation of art, and then in turn helps us teach it better to all the different age groups, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I would just add briefly, the notion of windows and mirrors in education, that artworks and experiences can both reflect back your own identity, but also can be a window into another person's. Those are very much foundational frameworks for how we think about how work will be encountered, what it teaches us about the maker of the object, what it teaches us about the subject of the object, but also how it will be experienced for various audience members. And, at least I've been so grateful for the opportunity to participate in the notion of developing a visual syllabus, if you will, for the collection at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and really thinking about how each and every object in the collection is a point of access, a handle into self-discovery, a discovery of art history, a sense of formal contemplation as well. All these layers are so rich.
And I think also that these works, and that's one of the other things, and we're getting questions in the chat, so we're going to get to those in a second, but I just wanted to say that, one very rich and valuable thing about the work, not only the work selected for today's presentation, but the intention and the thought process behind each acquisition for the collection is that these are works that can resonate in different contexts and can be unpacked coming from different backgrounds and different experiences. That's why I really like the Martorell as I've been thinking about COVID-19 and how, this experience is changing our society and our sense of community, just like that event in 2017 changed in PR. So we have a question from someone asking how many pieces were created for We the People and have they been displayed together?
So there are over 300 sculptures that and I don't know the exact number, Abby, you may know the exact number, 300 and something, that make up the full Statue of Liberty. And no, they have not been displayed together because the artist has purposefully wanted to never have them all displayed together. Now, there have been a number of installations where a few of the fragments or of the individual sculptures were shown together. One that I know of was in New York City, and it had two different locations. There were a few of them in City Hall Park, and then on the other side of the river in is it in Brooklyn Heights, I think, in the park there, which was really interesting because that location had the advantage of being able to see the Statue of Liberty when you were there, and looking at the sculpture. So it was that visual connection with the original. But Danvo has specifically said that he didn't want them to be all displayed together, or that the notion of reconstructing or putting them in the proximity of one another was against the intention of the artist. The other thing that's interesting about that, and we've actually seen that since we've had the piece, is that he gives no instructions as to how to display the piece. So you can put it vertical the way we have it in the gallery right now. You could display it horizontal, upside down. So every time you would do that, of course, there's a different spatial relationship. And he leaves that up to the individual museum or curator.
And for those who'd like to learn more about Janvo and the exhibition that Anna was talking about in 2014, it was called We the People through the Public Art Fund, and you can find a lot of material on the specific project on their website.
Yes.
Thank you, Abby.
Of course.
So I was wondering also, in thinking about some of the themes that we're looking at when we are thinking about these works and considering moments of crisis. And I've been thinking also about, works in our collection created during World War II and how those artists were looking at crisis. And there's one painting that is in very close proximity to We the People that was painted in 1944, right, in World War II. That makes me think of this. But what are some of the challenges that artists may face, Abby and Anna, when thinking about addressing crisis, when crisis becomes such an important part of their worldview?
Sure. Artists' approach to I'll jump in just briefly. And artists' approach to crises, vary. For some artists, it is something that seeps up in their work as much as any other context of where they're making. And we have also seen a growing generation of artists who also identify truly as activists, whose work is hand in hand with their priorities to help remake the world. And an example of that would be the collective group For Freedoms, that we have worked at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum very closely with the leaders of that organization, or that collective, Hank Willis Thomas and Eric Gottesman, both as individually as artists and in their collective works. And that's a great example, I think, Gisela, of practices that can take on activism as their core expression. But there are many, many others. And I would say that even in the case of the Carrie Mae Weems series and photographs, though it may not directly be linked to a crisis with a capital C, it's an expression of crisis in a personal way, a crisis of womanhood, a crisis of inequity, of race. She talked about in this particular series. Oh, sorry, I don't know if someone else could hear that, but Carrie Mae Weems spoke when she was in this series, that it was very hard for her. She was teaching at Hampshire at the time, and she was living in Massachusetts, and was trying to find a young Black girl to portray in this series with her to complete the composition. And there were very few children of color in the neighborhood. And she saw this young woman biking by and approached her, and with her family's permission, had her perform really for these photographs. So in many ways, in each of these expressions, from the small to those that are writ quite large publicly, they are acts of articulation and reflecting a point in time.
Yeah, and this actually connects with another question that came through the chat right now, that asks if the photographers on the ground covering the protests this year and in the past after Freddie Gray's death, for instance, can be considered art and not just photojournalism. And let me just say, photojournalism is art. I think the answer is yes. I think we will see many iconic images that will come to represent this historic moment. Of course, this gets us into a whole different, much larger conversation that I don't think we can tackle today, that I think we in museums are in the middle of, who defines what's art and what isn't, but we're not going to go there right now. But I do think that Abby mentioned earlier the notion of artists bearing witness, and I think that is very much part of it. And I think there are two levels to it, right? One is the recording right there in the moment that we're seeing happen very much right now. And I think the other will be, and will probably start relatively soon if it hasn't in certain cases already started, is what the artists will do with those images, right? How they will interpret them, how will they make them part of perhaps a longer narrative or a more comprehensive narrative, or in certain cases a more personal narrative. But those would be the sort of the raw material that artists will work with. So I think that and I know that any number of museums are already starting to collect images that have resulted in during these days from the protests and from what's going on, because they will become the next step in I think bodies of art that will reflect the moment. So apparently. Continuing on that, in this week's New Yorker, which I haven't seen yet, there's a photograph spread by a ceramics student at Tyler who could not get to the studio because of COVID-19. So he grabbed his camera and went out to photograph protests in Philadelphia. And so, yes, that is exactly what I was saying. And I'm going to have to go grab my copy of the New Yorker if it has arrived to look at it.
And I think that's why the space of the museum is so crucial, right? Because it gives it recontextualizes this material that is produced, whether it's the photographs or written accounts or other types of images, videos that may emerge, to be reconfigured and sort of following what Martorell did with the piece that I selected in this case and many others. And, having these works recontextualized in the space of the museum allows us to have a deeper engagement with them that transcends the moment of their creation as historical documents, right? To rethink and reflect on the events that that gave them way to exist in the world. So I think that's one area in which I feel, the work that we do at CFAM, because we are looking at these works to teach with them, we are very cognizant of that context and that legacy of having the works for our students and for future generations. Are there any other questions, Abby? Go ahead.
Sorry, I got a question in the chat that could actually be the topic of a much longer dialogue in itself, but maybe I'll just point to an answer to it. The question about thinking about the representation of the Black figure in art in this moment and whether women are portrayed in equal measure. And again, this idea of representation of looking historically through art at who has qualified as subject, who has qualified as object, is something that is very contested. And there have been some really wonderful exhibitions of late, both at CFAM, looking at the Black figure in art, as well as a very powerful show about a year and a half ago in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay that also looked at the historic representation of the Black figure in art and its predominance. In this particular moment, we have seen quite a proliferation of figure painting, and we have figurative painting, and in the Cornell Fine Arts Museum too, we have had a real attention and focus to looking at acquiring works of art that display all different kinds of individuals and people. In terms of African American artists, some works that I would point us to would be the tremendous portrait by Jordan Castile, by Firole Baez. These are women artists who, African American or artists of color, who are portraying other individuals in their community or in kind of broader structure of representation to give equal voice, because what we don't see, we can't talk about. What we do encounter visually, we're not aware of. And so, you know, that is a very short and by no means nearly insightful or accurate enough representation of the moment, but something that we could certainly turn to later. And I would encourage those of you who are interested in works of representation of the Black figure, and particularly of Black women, to go online to the Cornell Fine Arts Museum's collection and look both at works by Maleko Mgosi, which are in the general collection, and several works of art in the Alphon collection of contemporary art, because you'll see there's a vast array. And it's something that we are constantly working to enhance and improve and find new ways to study.
Yes.
Thank you, Abby. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any additional questions on my chat. Okay, Anna, is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap up? You're muted, and I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, I just muted myself and then started talking. Just wanted to thank you to Gisela and Abigail for participating today and for all the work that you do for our museum, and thank you all who participated in the conversation. We miss you. We miss being in the galleries with you, and we hope that we can start welcoming visitors back into the gallery in mid-July. We will let you know as soon as we know the exact date. Somebody just wrote that they put a question in the Q&A, but I don't see a new question.
I don't see the Q&A. So yeah, if you want to put your question right on here on the chat,
Dennis, I can
happy to.
Yeah, the question was, are there other art pieces at Rollins or elsewhere that reflect or comment on the crisis of divisiveness in our country at this time? And again, yes, there is an array, both not that are specifically made in the past 3 months, but that are looking at these questions of race and equity and inclusion for a long time. One work I might point you to, Dennis, is a piece by Alfredo Yar called Logo for America, which is a documentation of a public artwork that the artist presented in Times Square. I want to say in the late 70s. I might have that date wrong. But we'd be happy to engage with you over email separately and can give you a list of works. But there is quite a focus, because the collection is used for teaching and education and pedagogy. There's quite a focus on representing all different moments in our political history, and we look forward to engaging with you on them further. And actually, Gisela is also reinstalling the education gallery at the museum, which will have some great examples for you as well.
Yeah, so we have reinstalled the education gallery with works that address some of the issues that we are seeing right now unfolding, and kind of thinking over those, you know, from protest to freedom of speech to Martin Luther King and his legacy, and other things. So we'll go into more detail with those in other events, virtual events during this summer, and of course it will be available when the museum reopens. So thank you all for joining us for this conversation here today. Please continue to.
I'm sorry, Gisela, one moment. There's one more question here. How do we, as art lovers, rectify the complicated history that is so intertwined with many of our most famous artists? How do we use images of people of color from racist artists into a new way to help the Black Lives Matter movement and regain autonomy for these people? And this is a great question that is again, a little bit, it would require its own conversation, and I'm thinking we should do it because when we look at historical art today, we picked specifically works of contemporary art, but when you look at historical art, it becomes even more complicated. And I know that a lot of museums, and I know that we at CFAM are starting to do that hard work of contextualizing our historical collection. Some people, include that in the word of decolonizing our museums, but that's a complicated term in and of itself. But I would say that what we need to do in order to acknowledge that is to create a better and more complete context for the works that we show that are historical and that may involve, the complicated histories of which only a side has been traditionally shown. We need to unveil the other side. We need to unveil the other half and talk about the artists who were involved, or of course commissioners of work and historical characters that were portrayed, that were slaveholders, that were involved in acts of racism and discrimination and et cetera. But so that is, at this point, that needs to be done, I think, primarily through the work of research and then reinstalling collection galleries to attest to that research.
Thank you all so much. We ran a little bit over, and we know that's a no-no in the land of Zooming. In a future conversation, we promise to keep it tighter, but there are so many good questions and dialogues that came out of this. So thank you for letting me participate, Anna and Gisela.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Abby, Anna, and thank you all of you for joining us here today. I was going to say follow us on social media for the dates for the next few events that we have scheduled for the summer, so that we may continue this conversation virtually and hopefully soon in the galleries as well. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.